For more than 70 years, Russia was hidden behind the Iron Curtain. What existed beyond was often reduced to fragments. A place difficult to access and even harder to understand. The largest country in the world, stretching from Eastern Europe all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It is not a single landscape, but a sequence of them. Vast plains give way to deep forests. Mountain ranges rise and fall across thousands of miles. Lake Baikal holds roughly 20% of the world's unfrozen freshwater. The volcanoes of Kamchatka form one of the most active geothermal zones in the world. Russia is often treated as a synonym for cold, and not without reason. Much of the country lies in high latitudes, where winters are long and temperatures can fall well below -20 degrees Fahrenheit. But climate is only one layer. Russia also brings together dozens of peoples across its territory. Orthodox Christianity is the majority faith, but Islam has deep historical roots. And in some regions, even Buddhism is practiced openly. In this video, we will try to lift that curtain and take you on a journey across this vast, complex, and still largely unknown land. With a population exceeding 13 million, Moscow is the largest city in Europe. An immense urban organism stretching across almost 1,000 square miles. Economically, it is among the wealthiest cities in the world, generating a significant share of Russia's GDP. At its core lies the Kremlin, the symbolic heart of Russia. Its origins trace back to 1147, but the fortress as we know it began to take shape in the late 15th century under Ivan III. Italian architects were invited to redesign it, replacing wooden walls with red brick fortifications that still stand today. Enclosed within its walls are cathedrals, palaces, and government buildings. Once the residence of czars, Kremlin still remains the official seat of power. The residence of the President of Russia and the center of federal authority. Beyond its walls opens Red Square, one of the most recognizable urban spaces in the world. Measuring over 1,000 feet in length, it has served as a parade ground and a stage for state ceremonies. At its southern end rises St. Basil's Cathedral, completed in 1561 under Ivan the Terrible to commemorate the conquest of Kazan. Its colorful onion domes, arranged asymmetrically, are often mistaken as whimsical, but their design follows a symbolic geometry. Moving into the 20th century, Moscow underwent a dramatic transformation under Joseph Stalin. The skyline was redefined by the construction of the so-called Seven Sisters. These high-rises combined Gothic verticality with Soviet monumentalism, each reaching heights of over 200 meters. They were intended not only as functional buildings, but as ideological statements. Beneath the surface, another world unfolds: the Moscow Metro. Opened in 1935, it was designed as both a transportation system and a showcase of Soviet achievement. Its stations are renowned for their elaborate design. Marble columns, chandeliers, mosaics, and sculptures. Each was conceived as a palace for the people. To the north of the city center lies Vdeyanha, an exhibition complex originally opened in 1939. Its name translates to the Exhibition of Achievements of National Economy. Covering more than 300 hectares, it was designed to display accomplishments of the Soviet Union. Pavilions represented different republics and sectors, each built in distinct architectural styles. In recent decades, Moscow has continued to evolve. The most visible symbol of this transformation is the International Business Center. Rising along the Moskva River, this cluster of skyscrapers represents a new phase of economic ambition. Glass and steel have replaced stone and ornament, signaling integration into global architectural trends. For centuries, Moscow stood as the political and spiritual center of a unified Russian state. But at the beginning of the 18th century, that axis shifted. Tsar Peter the Great, determined to modernize his empire and open it to Europe, made a radical decision. In 1703, on the marshy delta of the Neva River, he founded St. Petersburg. Recently seized from Sweden during the Great Northern War, it gave Russia direct access to European trade routes. Tens of thousands of laborers worked to drain swamps and lay out the foundations of a new imperial city. At the very origin point of St. Petersburg stands the Peter and Paul Fortress. Established the same year as the city itself, it was never truly intended as a defensive stronghold. Instead, it became a symbol of imperial authority. Within its walls rises the Peter and Paul Cathedral, whose golden spire, reaching 400 feet, long dominated the skyline. But St. Petersburg was never meant to resemble Moscow. It was conceived as a deliberate departure, a window to Europe. To realize this vision, the finest architects of the time were invited from across Europe. Along the banks of the Neva and its canals rose palaces of extraordinary opulence. Among them, the most iconic is the Winter Palace, completed in the mid-18th century. With more than 1,500 rooms, it served as the official residence of the Russian emperors. Today, it forms part of the Hermitage complex, one of the largest museums in the world. Built across a network of islands, St. Petersburg is interlaced with rivers and canals. This geography gave rise to one of its most distinctive features, the drawbridges. Each night during the navigation season, massive sections of the city's bridges lift to allow ships to pass. Central spans rise into the night sky in a slow, mechanical choreography. A ritual that has come to define the rhythm of the city. Beyond the formal symmetry of St. Petersburg, the imperial vision extended into the surrounding countryside. Where the Russian emperors built a ring of residences that rivaled, and in some cases surpassed, the grandeur of the capital itself. Foremost among them is Peterhof Palace, located on the southern shore of the Gulf of Finland. Commissioned by Peter the Great in the early 18th century, Peterhof was intended as a Russian answer to Versailles. The complex is defined by its vast system of fountains, more than 150 in total, fed by gravity alone. Water is channeled from natural springs through a carefully engineered network of reservoirs and pipes. At the center of it all is the Grand Cascade, a monumental arrangement of statues and waterfalls descending toward the sea. Gilded sculptures, most famously Samson tearing open the jaws of a lion, symbolize Russia's victory in the Great Northern War. Located in the town of Tsarskoye Selo, the Catherine Palace originally began as a modest residence. But in the mid-18th century, under Empress Elizabeth, was transformed into a masterpiece of Russian Baroque. Its facade stretches over 1,000 feet, painted in a striking blue and white, accented with columns. The palace's most famous interior, the Amber Room, was constructed using panels of amber backed with gold leaf and mirrors. It was looted during World War II and later meticulously reconstructed. Out in the Gulf of Finland, Kronstadt was conceived as both shield and sword. a heavily fortified naval base designed to protect the new capital. Built on Kotlin Island, it quickly became the principal base of the Baltic fleet. A ring of forts constructed on artificial islands extended far into the surrounding waters. These fortifications formed a layered defensive system, sealing off St. Petersburg from naval attack. At the heart of Kronstadt rises its most striking landmark, the Naval Cathedral of St. Nicholas. Completed in 1913, it was designed as the spiritual center of the Russian Navy. After the Russian Revolution, the cathedral was closed and repurposed for decades. Only in the 21st century was it fully restored to its original function. Long before Moscow rose to dominance, and nearly a millennium before St. Petersburg was carved out of marshland, there was Veliki Novgorod. First mentioned in chronicles in 859, Novgorod emerged as something unusual for its time, a medieval republic. At its center was the Veche, a public assembly where citizens could, at least in theory, influence decisions. The physical heart of this system still stands today, the Novgorod Kremlin, also known as the Detonets. Its earliest fortifications date back to the 11th century, though the current red brick walls were largely constructed in the 15th century. Within those walls rises one of the oldest stone buildings in Russia, the St. Sophia Cathedral. Built between 1045 and 1050, it predates many of the iconic churches of Moscow. Its architecture is austere and monumental. Massive walls, narrow windows, and a cluster of helmet-shaped domes. For centuries, St. Sophia was the spiritual center of Novgorod, and in many ways, of early Russian Orthodoxy itself. Long before Moscow consolidated power, the surrounding towns were independent principalities. Each city had its own prince. Fortified walls rose above rivers. Cathedrals were built in white stone. But the Mongol invasion in the 13th century devastated much of the region. Out of that disruption, Moscow would eventually rise, but the legacy of these earlier centers remains preserved. One of the most significant among them is Vladimir. In the 12th century, it briefly served as the capital of one of the most powerful states of its time. The Dormition Cathedral, completed in 1158, rises above the Klyazma River as a symbol of political authority. Its interior was adorned with frescoes by Andrei Rublev, one of the most revered icon painters in Russian history. Just outside the city, a single white stone church rises above open meadows. The Church of the Intercession on the Ural, built in 1165. It is often considered one of the most beautiful churches in Russia, not because of ornament, but because of balance and setting. Not far from Vladimir lies Suzdal. Unlike other cities that industrialized or expanded, this town remained small. Today, it has a population of under 10,000, but contains dozens of churches and monasteries. There are no high-rise buildings, only wooden houses, onion domes, and open fields. Further along the route stands Sergeyev Posad, home to the most important monastery in the country. Founded in 1337, the Trinity Lavra of St. Sergius became a spiritual center of Russian Orthodoxy. Surrounded by fortified walls, the monastery remains active to this day, drawing pilgrims from across Russia. Then there is Rostov Veliki, one of the oldest towns in the country, with origins dating back to the 9th century. Its Kremlin, set along the shores of Lake Nero, is among the most visually striking in Russia. Unlike the defensive fortresses of other cities, the Rostov Kremlin was built primarily as a residence for the metropolitan bishop. Its white walls and silver domes reflect in the still waters of the lake, creating an almost theatrical composition. Flowing quietly through forests, plains, and cities, the Volga River is the central artery of Western Russia. Stretching over 2,000 miles, it winds its way southward before emptying into the Caspian Sea. From its earliest days, the Volga served as a trade corridor. It linked northern forests with the markets of the south. Viking traders, known as Varangians, once navigated these waters, establishing routes that tied Eastern Europe to Byzantium. In the 20th century, Volga was heavily engineered, transformed into a system of reservoirs and hydroelectric stations. Massive dams created vast artificial lakes, regulating water levels and generating power. This reshaped the river's natural rhythm, slowing its current and enabling large-scale navigation. As the Volga River flows eastward, the cultural landscape begins to shift. In Kazan, the identity of Russia becomes more complex. Slender minarets and crescent moons appear beside onion domes. Founded over 1,000 years ago, Kazan developed as a major center of the Volga Bulgars, an early state that adopted Islam long before much of Russia embraced Christianity. This legacy endured through the rise of the Kazan Khanate, a powerful state that controlled key sections of the Volga trade routes. But in 1552, Ivan the Terrible launched a campaign against the city. After a prolonged siege, Kazan was captured and incorporated into the expanding Russian state. Yet it did not lose its identity, evolving into a place where cultures coexist. Today, it is the capital of the Republic of Tatarstan, where Islam and Orthodox Christianity exist side by side. Nearby, Sviazhsk was founded by Ivan the Terrible as a military base during his campaign against Kazan. What sets it apart is the method of its construction. The fortress was built in advance, hundreds of miles away. Timber walls and buildings were assembled, then dismantled, transported, and reassembled on site in just a few weeks. It was a highly organized operation, essentially a prefabricated city, deployed deep in contested territory. From this position, Russian forces were able to secure a strategic foothold. Within a year, the campaign succeeded. With its military purpose fulfilled, Sviazhsk began to change. Fortifications gave way to religious life. Monasteries were established, churches were built, and the settlement gradually transformed into a spiritual center. Further down, the Volga River bends toward one of the most historically charged cities in Russia, Volgograd. Before 1961, it was known as Stalingrad, and under that name, it became the site of one of the most brutal battles in human history. Between August 1942 and February 1943, German and Soviet forces fought for control of the city. Street by street, building by building, the fighting reduced Stalingrad to rubble. In 1943, Soviet forces surrounded the German army, marking a turning point in the war, when the advance of Nazi Germany was not just halted, but reversed. That history is concentrated on a single hill overlooking the city, Mamayev Kurgan. The the site of one of the most imposing war memorials ever built. The Motherland Calls. Completed in 1967, the statue stands almost 300 feet tall. It depicts a female figure striding forward, sword raised, calling her people to defend the homeland. Stretching across the Caspian lowlands, Kalmykia is a region unlike any other in the country. The ancestors of Kalmyks migrated westward from Central Asia in the 17th century, settling along the lower Volga. With them, they brought Tibetan Buddhism, preserving traditions, language, and religious practices. In 1943, under Stalin, the Kalmyk population was forcibly deported to Siberia. Monasteries were destroyed, and the region was effectively erased as an autonomous entity. Only in the late 1950s were the Kalmyks allowed to return, beginning a slow process of rebuilding their cultural identity. In Elista, the largest Buddhist temple in Europe, stands almost 200 feet tall, showcasing traditional Tibetan architecture. Inside, a towering statue of Buddha, covered in gold leaf, dominates the central hall. Further south, in Dagestan, geography takes control. This is one of the most topographically complex regions in Russia. A place defined by a collision of extremes, canyons, cliffs, and fast-moving rivers cutting through stone. The eastern edge of the Caucasus Mountains rises sharply here, forming a dense network of ridges and deep gorges. Carved over millions of years, the Sulak Canyon reaches depths of over 6,000 feet, even surpassing the Grand Canyon in certain sections. Water finds its way through these elevations in the form of waterfalls, seasonal and permanent. Villages cling to these landscapes. Built on ledges, they reflect centuries of adaptation to terrain. Stone construction, terraced slopes, and defensive positioning all speak to a history where geography dictated survival. Perched at around 5,000 feet above sea level, Gamsutl was once fully inhabited. Stone houses were constructed directly into the mountainside, stacked in tiers, each level forming both a home and a defensive line. For centuries, people lived here, adapting to the conditions of altitude and isolation. But in the 20th century, that relationship began to break down. As roads improved elsewhere and economic centers shifted to lower elevations, villages like Gamsutul started to empty. By the early 2000s, only a single resident remained. When he died in 2015, Gamsutul became completely abandoned. Since then, the village stands as a shell. Its stone walls still intact, but roofs collapsed, interiors exposed to the elements. Grass grows through doorways, windows frame empty sky. Overlooking Derbent from a dominant cliff, Narinkala Fortress once controlled the movement of entire civilizations. To the west, steep mountains rise sharply. To the east, the Caspian forms a natural barrier. Between them lies a narrow passage, the only viable route between the Eurasia and the Middle East. The fortress that dominates it today dates largely to the 6th century, built under the Sasanian Persian Empire. What the Sasanians created was not just a stronghold, but an integrated defensive system. 2 massive stone walls extend outward from the citadel. Originally, they sealed off the entire passage, forming a barrier that could block movement completely. The scale is still visible today. Sections of the walls remain intact, rising over 60 feet in height. Deeper into the Caucasus, the terrain becomes more severe, hiding entire histories within the folds of the mountains. In North Ossetia lies one of the most haunting sites in the region, the Dargav's necropolis. Often referred to as the City of the Dead, it consists of nearly 100 stone crypts scattered across a hillside. Each crypt is built from local stone, with steep, pyramid-shaped roofs designed to shed snow and withstand harsh mountain weather. Inside, the deceased were placed in wooden coffins, some shaped like small boats, reflecting ancient beliefs about the journey after death. Further east, in the mountains of Ingushetia, another form of highland architecture rises. The Ingush Towers, built between the 14th and 17th centuries, are constructed from precisely fitted stone, without mortar. Rising up to 100 feet, they taper slightly as they ascend, giving them both stability and a distinct silhouette. Positioned within line of sight of one another, each tower functioned as part of a broader defensive network. Above the western reaches of the Caucasus Mountains, Mount Elbrus dominates the landscape. At over 18,000 feet, Elbrus is the highest peak in Europe. It is not a jagged alpine summit, but a massive volcanic dome. Broad, symmetrical, and capped with twin peaks. Both are remnants of a dormant stratovolcano, formed hundreds of thousands of years ago through repeated eruptions. Though now considered inactive, the mountain still shows geothermal activity beneath its surface. The glaciers that cover much of the mountain feed rivers that flow into both the Black Sea and the Caspian Basin. Climbing Elbrus has become a benchmark. It is one of the 7 summits, the highest peaks on each continent. Routes on the southern side are supported by cable cars and infrastructure, making it one of the more accessible high-altitude climbs. Stretching for more than 86 miles along the Black Sea coastline, Sochi is one of the longest cities in Europe. But its defining feature is not the size, but subtropical environment. Sheltered by the Caucasus Mountains to the north, cold continental air masses are largely blocked. As a result, Sochi has a warm, humid climate, rare for Russia. Winters are mild, while summers are long and humid. This combination has made Sochi the country's primary seaside resort for more than a century. During the late Russian Empire, and especially in the Soviet period, it was developed as a health and recreation center. Sanatoriums, resorts, and spas were built along the coast, attracting visitors seeking both relax and treatment. Yet Sochi is not only about the sea. Just inland, the land rises sharply into the Caucasus. Within less than an hour, it is possible to move from subtropical coastline to alpine terrain. This geographic contrast became globally visible during the 2014 Winter Olympics, when Sochi hosted the Games. Events were split between the coastal cluster and the mountain venues in Krasnaya Poliana. Further along the shores of the Black Sea, the land curves into a peninsula that has long stood at the crossroads of empires, Crimea. Geographically, Crimea is compact, but strategically it's immense. Surrounded by water on 3 sides, it has for centuries controlled access between the Black Sea and the interior of Eastern Europe. In 1783, the peninsula was conquered by the Russian Empire under Catherine the Great. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Crimea became part of independent Ukraine. Then, in 2014, Russia annexed the peninsula, a move still unresolved in terms of recognition. Beside its geopolitical importance, Crimea is also a sought-after holiday destination. Along its southern coast, mountains rise close to the sea, forming a natural barrier that traps warm air. During the 19th century, the Russian elite began building summer residences here. Along the coast villas appeared one after another, overlooking the waters of the Black Sea. One of them is special. Perched on the edge of a 130-feet-high cliff, the Swallow's Nest looks like a medieval fortress. But the illusion is deliberate. The building in its current form dates to 1912, designed in a neo-Gothic style. It was never intended as a defensive structure, instead conceived as a romantic statement. The structure occupies a tiny plot, barely large enough to support its footprint. Below, the sea stretches uninterrupted to the horizon. Above, the land rises sharply, leaving the building exposed on all sides. Originally commissioned as a private residence, Swallow's Nest changed hands several times. After the Russian Revolution, it was nationalized and repurposed, becoming a restaurant and later a cultural site. More than any resort town, Sevastopol exists for one purpose: control of the Black Sea. Founded under Catherine the Great, the city was established as the main base of the Black Sea Fleet. The coastline here forms a series of deep, sheltered bays, ideal for anchoring warships. In the mid-19th century, during the Crimean War, Sevastopol became the focal point of a prolonged siege. Almost a century later, during World War II, it was besieged again by German forces between 1941 and 1942. The fighting was intense and prolonged, with heavy artillery and aerial bombardment reducing much of the city to ruins. For its resistance, Sevastopol was later awarded the title of Hero City, a designation reserved for places of exceptional wartime endurance. After the fall of Soviet Union, the fleet continued to operate from its harbors under agreements between Russia and Ukraine. And in 2014, Russia took full control of the city. But this protected harbor was considered important long before modern borders took shape. That deep history is still visible in the ruins of Chersonesus Taurica, a settlement founded in the 5th century BC by Greek colonists. What began as a distant outpost, over time evolved into a fully developed polis. Chersonesus was part of a larger system linking the northern Black Sea coast to the Mediterranean world. The city was carefully planned, laid out with a grid of streets that reflected classical Greek urban design. Later, the city became part of the Byzantine Empire, serving as a northern outpost of influence. According to historical tradition, it was here that Prince Vladimir of Kiev was baptized in 988, spreading Christianity across Kievan Rus. That moment connects these ruins not just to ancient trade, but to the religious foundations of an entire region. Moving forward in time, along the southeastern coast of Crimea, the ruins of antiquity give way to the Middle Ages. Unlike the ancient remains of Chersonesus, the Sudak fortress still holds its shape. The stronghold as it stands today was largely built in the 14th century by the Republic of Genoa. At the time, Italian merchant powers were expanding their trade networks across the Black Sea, establishing fortified ports. Sudak, then known as Soldaya, became one of their key strongholds. The Genoese reinforced it with thick stone walls stretching over 2 kilometers, punctuated by a series of towers. But control of Sudak was never permanent. The Genoese held it for over a century before losing it to the expanding Ottoman Empire in 1475. Under Ottoman rule, the fortress remained in use, though its importance gradually declined as trade routes shifted. With no direct land connection to mainland Russia, Kaliningrad Oblast is a unique region, an exclave. At its center stands Kaliningrad, a city that did not begin as Russian at all. For centuries, it was known as Königsberg. Founded in the 13th century by the Teutonic Knights. During World War II, Königsberg was heavily bombed by Allied forces and later subjected to intense fighting. In the aftermath of the war, the region was transferred to the Soviet Union under the Potsdam Agreement, and the city was renamed Kaliningrad. Reconstruction followed, but not as restoration. Much of the historic German architecture was not rebuilt. Yet one structure survived, and today it anchors the city's connection to its past: the Königsberg Cathedral. Originally built in the 14th century, the cathedral is one of the few major historical buildings to endure the war. For decades, it stood as a ruin, walls intact, but the interiors destroyed. Only in the 1990s was it fully restored. The tomb of the famous philosopher Immanuel Kant lies just outside the northeast corner of the cathedral. North of Kaliningrad, where the land thins into a narrow ribbon, lies one of the most unusual landscapes in Europe: Curonian Spit. On one side, waves from the open sea. On the other, calm, shallow waters. The Curonian Spit is not stable ground. It is a living formation, built from sand carried by coastal currents. Over centuries, massive dunes have formed here, some rising over 40 feet high. They move slowly but persistently, advancing inland, burying entire settlements. By the 18th and 19th centuries, this movement became a serious problem. Villages were swallowed by sand. In response, large-scale efforts were launched to stabilize the ground. Grasses and trees were planted. Along the coast, open dunes still dominate. Further inland, dense forests take over, their roots holding the sand in place. Far to the north, on an island in Lake Onega, Kizhi Pogost is built entirely from wood. Assembled without nails, shaped by hand, and designed to endure harsh northern conditions. The centerpiece is the Church of the Transfiguration, completed in 1714. It rises to a height of over 110 feet and is crowned with 22 onion domes arranged in tiers. Each dome is covered with wooden shingles designed to reflect light and shed water efficiently. The entire structure is built using interlocking log construction, a technique refined over centuries in the forests of northern Russia. Next to it stands the Church of the Intercession, built decades later. Smaller in scale, but equally precise in design. Together they form the core of the pogost, a term used for a rural ecclesiastical enclosure. At first glance, Ruskayala Marble Canyon feels like a natural formation. Sheer cliffs dropping into emerald-colored water. The canyon stretches for hundreds of feet, its vertical walls reflecting in the flooded basin below. But this is not a geological accident. It is a former marble quarry, one that supplied stone for St. Petersburg. Mining began here in the 18th century as Russia expanded and monumental construction accelerated. By the 20th century, operations eventually stopped. The site was abandoned, and groundwater gradually filled the pits. Reaching Ruskayala is part of the experience. From Sortavala, a restored heritage railway connects it to the town. Along this route runs a retro-style train designed to evoke the golden age of steam-powered locomotives. The Ruskayala Express moves through dense forests, following a historic line that once served industrial transport. On the northern edge of the Gulf of Finland, Vyborg has shifted control several times over the centuries, and each period left a visible layer. At its center, rising above the harbor on a small island, stands the structure that defined it from the beginning. The Vyborg Castle. The fortress was founded in 1293 during the Swedish Crusades into the eastern Baltic. Its core is a massive stone keep, St. Olaf's Tower, rising more than 130 feet above the surrounding landscape. Vyborg remained under Swedish control until the early 18th century, when it was captured by Peter the Great. Later, the city became part of newly independent Finland, only to change hands again during the conflicts of World War II. Few cities in the region have experienced such repeated transitions. The old town reflects this layered past. Along the streets, European-style facades appear alongside Soviet-era buildings. The largest city in the world north of the polar circle is Murmansk. Despite its latitude, the harbor never freezes, a quirk of oceanic geography that changed the course of history. Warm currents from the North Atlantic flow into these waters, keeping the port ice-free even in the depth of winter. This made Murmansk a lifeline. First for Tsarist Russia, then for the Soviet Union, and still today for modern Russia's Arctic ambitions. During World War II, Murmansk became one of the Soviet Union's most important strategic ports. Allied convoys, loaded with tanks, food, fuel, and ammunition, braved the North Atlantic and Arctic storms to reach this coast. Sikum. High on a hill overlooking the city stands the Alyosha Monument, a massive statue of a Soviet soldier watching over the harbor. Built in 1974, it commemorates the defenders of the Arctic during the war. The light here has its own rules. In winter, the sun never rises, just a dim glow on the horizon. In summer, it never sets. A 2-hour drive northeast of Murmansk, the asphalt ends at Tereberka. A fishing village scattered along a gray Arctic bay. For a long time, hardly anyone outside the Kola Peninsula had heard of this place. Then a film changed that. When Leviathan was released in 2014, its bleak beauty brought global attention to Tereberka. But the story here began long before cinema. For decades, its boats supplied Murmansk with fish. Then, like many remote Arctic towns, it fell silent. The Soviet Union collapsed, the fishing quotas vanished, and the young left for cities. Down the road from the village, on the shore of a quiet inlet, lies Tereberka's most haunting sight, the ship graveyard. Dozens of wooden and steel fishing vessels rest half-submerged in the shallows. Once the pride of a thriving fleet, they were left to rot when the fishing industry crumpled. But now tourists arrive to see the edge of the world. There's a small guest house, a cafe that serves fresh cod soup, and a sense that life here is balancing between the past and something new. Isolated by the freezing waters of the White Sea, Solovetski Islands still bear scars of the Stalin's regime. In the 1400s, two monks, Savity and Hermann, founded a monastery here, carving out a sanctuary among the rocks and pines. The Solovetski Monastery grew into one of Russia's most important religious centers, a symbol of faith at the edge of the known world. But isolation is a double-edged thing. What protects also confines, and what begins in faith can end in fear. In the 1920s, the Solovetski Special Purpose Camp became the model for what would later spread across the Soviet Union, the Gulag system. Many who ended up in Vorkuta or Kolyma first passed through here. Prisoners felled timber, quarried stone, and struggled through winters that froze the sea solid. Some were priests who once served in the monastery, others were scholars, farmers, or workers caught in the machinery of ideology. Solovki show how closely human faith and cruelty can coexist. How the same walls that once sheltered prayer later contained suffering. Running from the Arctic Ocean to the steppes of Kazakhstan, the Ural Mountains form one of the most significant natural boundaries on Earth. For centuries, they have been marking the conventional border between Europe and Asia. Unlike dramatic ranges such as the Himalayas or the Alps, the Urals are relatively low and worn. Because these mountains are ancient, over 250 to 300 million years old, erosion has steadily reduced them. What remains today is a range that rarely exceeds 6,000 feet in elevation. With its highest point, Mount Narodnaya, reaching 6,200 feet. Despite their modest height, the Urals are exceptionally rich in mineral resources. The same geological processes that created the mountains also concentrated metals and gemstones within them. This mineral wealth turned the region into one of Russia's key industrial zones, particularly from the 18th century. Deep in the remote northern reaches of the Ural Mountains, a group of towering pillars rise from an open plateau. Manpupuna rock formations. Seven massive pillar-like structures, some reaching heights of up to 130 feet, stand isolated against the horizon. Their shapes are irregular, worn, uneven, sometimes wider at the top than at the base. They do not resemble typical mountain peaks. Instead, they appear as remnants, what is left after everything else has been stripped away. Geologically, that is exactly what they are. These formations are the result of differential erosion. Over time, wind and water gradually removed weaker materials. What remained were the most durable rock columns. Their location adds to their impact. The plateau on which they stand is largely flat and open. They rise directly from the landscape, uninterrupted, making their scale more pronounced. Meanwhile, at the western foothills of the Urals lies one of the most extensive cave systems in Russia, Kungur Ice Cave. Explorations date back to the 17th century, but detailed scientific study came later as researchers sought to understand its unusual internal climate. Because, unlike most caves, Kungur contains permanent ice formations throughout the year. This is due to natural air circulation. In winter, cold air flows into the cave and settles in its lower chambers. Warmer air cannot easily displace it, creating a stable cold zone. Over time, this allows ice to accumulate. Inside, the cave is divided into more than 40 chambers, or grottos, each with distinct features. Some are filled with ice formations, others contain underground lakes, filled with still, dark water. Certain chambers remain below freezing year-round, preserving their ice structures in stable conditions. In Siberia, most cities feel improvised, built fast to serve an industry. But Tobolsk is different. Here, history lingers in stone. It's the oldest Russian settlement beyond the Urals, founded in 1587, where conquest and exile collided on the edge of an unknown world. The city stands high above the Irtysh River, split in two. Down below, the lower town, the sprawl of everyday life. And above it, on the bluff, the Tobolsk Kremlin, the only stone Kremlin in all of Siberia. In its center is the Sophia Assumption Cathedral, built in the 1680s, the first stone church in Siberia. From Tobolsk, Russia pushed further east, mapping rivers, founding forts, building the skeleton of a frontier that seemed endless. But this remote outpost wasn't just empire. It was also exile. Decembrists, dissidents, and dreamers all ended up here. Even the Romanov family passed through in 1917, before their transfer to Yekaterinburg, a stop on the way to tragedy. Compared to Tobolsk's 4 centuries, Novosibirsk is young. Founded in 1893, it didn't even exist when the Romanovs were still looking east. And yet, in just over a century, it's grown into the largest city in Siberia. The reason? Rails and rivers. Novosibirsk was born at a crossing point on the Trans-Siberian Railway, where engineers needed a bridge over the mighty Ob River. The settlement that sprouted here was first called Novonikolaevsk, a workers' camp more than a city. But railroads change everything. Trains brought people, supplies, and ambition, and by the 20th century, this upstart was outpacing the old Siberian strongholds. Today, Novosibirsk feels like Siberia turned inside out. Industry, culture, and science stacked into one sprawling metropolis of nearly 1.6 million people. It's easy to forget, walking these streets, that the city is younger than the Eiffel Tower. But that's its story: speed, reinvention, scale. And while Novosibirsk is the capital of Siberia, Yekaterinburg is the frontier, the line where Europe and Asia meet. The city was founded in 1723, named after Catherine I, wife of Peter the Great. The Urals are rich in iron and copper, and Yekaterinburg became a center for mining, smelting, and engineering. By the 19th century, it was one of Russia's busiest trade hubs, not Moscow or St. Petersburg, but it mattered. And then came the moment that forever tied Yekaterinburg to Russian history. In 1918, the last Tsar, Nicholas II, and his family were executed here. The Romanovs' end was brutal and final, a dynasty collapsing in a basement. Today, on that spot, the church on the blood rises with golden domes. But Yekaterinburg isn't frozen in tragedy. During the Soviet years, it was renamed Sverdlovsk and transformed into an industrial zone. The city grew fast, and it never stopped. Today, Yekaterinburg is Russia's fourth largest metropolis, with about 1.5 million people. The skyline mixes Soviet concrete with glass towers, modern skyscrapers with ornate wooden facades. Yekaterinburg is neither fully European nor fully Siberian. It's both. Officially known as the Sakha Republic, Yakutia covers more than 1 million square miles, making it larger than most countries. But scale is not what defines it. Cold does. Temperatures routinely drop below -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and in some areas, far lower. The ground itself remains permanently frozen. At the center of this frozen landscape stands Yakutsk, the coldest major city on Earth. With a population of over 300,000, it operates under conditions that would shut down most urban systems elsewhere. Buildings are constructed on stilts to prevent heat from melting the permafrost below. Further east, Oymyakon is often cited as the coldest permanently inhabited place on Earth. In 1933, a temperature of -90 degrees Fahrenheit was recorded here, one of the lowest ever measured in the Northern Hemisphere. But beneath these frozen ground lies significant mineral wealth: diamonds. At the center of that industry is the Mirny mine. Discovered in the 1950s during the Soviet era, the site quickly became one of the largest open-pit diamond mines in the world. The scale is difficult to grasp. The quarry is over 1,600 feet deep and more than 3,000 feet across. From above, it appears as a massive spiral carved into the earth. Yakutsk sits on the frozen banks of the Lena River, a massive artery cutting through the heart of Siberia. A few hundred kilometers upstream, nature carved a masterpiece in stone. At first glance, the Lena Pillars look almost too perfect, too symmetrical. Gigantic limestone spires, some shaped like needles, some like columns. Sculpted over 500 million years during the Cambrian. Reaching more than 300 feet into the sky, their surfaces are streaked and fractured, layered with sedimentary lines. From a distance, they look like a city built by a forgotten civilization. Up close, the scale is staggering. One feels impossibly small in their shadow. Each pillar is a vertical timeline, a record of changing seas, shifting climates, and ancient ecosystems. They exist for their own reasons, shaped by forces so vast that our brief lives feel like nothing. Few places on the planet feel as alive as Kamchatka. It sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire, a restless seam where tectonic plates grind. More than 300 volcanoes rise from the land, 29 of them still active. The most imposing of them all is Kluchevskaya Sopka, one of the most active anywhere on Earth. It has erupted dozens of times in recorded history, throwing ash plumes high into the stratosphere. And then there is the Valley of Geysers. Accessible only by helicopter, it is one of the largest geothermal fields on Earth. Jets of boiling water blast skyward, Steam clouds rise from the earth. Mud pots bubble and spit. Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, the capital, sits in Avacha Bay, embraced by volcanic cones on all sides. Life here is tied to the sea. Fishing fleets fill the harbor, their decks stacked with crab pots and nets. And sharing that harbor are the real locals, stellar sea lions. They haul themselves onto breakwaters and piers, massive and loud, barking at one another. Each year, salmon surge upriver from the Pacific, driven by instinct to return to the streams where they were born. The rivers of Kamchatka run thick with them, the water seeming to boil as the fish push upstream. On the riverbanks wait the brown bears. They wade into the current, standing still as the salmon swarm past their legs. With a quick swipe, a fish is airborne, clamped in jaws, devoured on the spot. Bears gorge until the season ends, until their bodies are fat enough to endure the long Arctic winter. Russia's Pacific window, Vladivostok, is closer to Tokyo than to Moscow, yet bound to the west by a line of iron rails. The name means rule the East. Sounds like ambition, maybe arrogance. The city was founded in 1860, when the Russian Empire decided it wanted a foothold on the Pacific. A port, a fortress, a symbol that the empire's reach did not end with Siberia. During the Soviet era, Vladivostok was closed to foreigners, a secret city hidden from the outside world. Only in 1992, after the Soviet Union fell, did the gates open again. The Golden Horn Bay curves into the city. Hills rise on every side, their slopes thick with apartment blocks. The Russky Bridge, the longest cable-stayed bridge in the world, leaps towards the island with same name, where students and researchers now fill what was once a military zone. Vladivostok lives in contradictions, European in architecture, Asian in flavor. Beyond city limits, forest begins, the Ussuri taiga. Dense, dark, endless, a wilderness pressed against the Pacific. Larch and pine mix with oak and cedar, a tangle of undergrowth alive with insects and birds. The taiga here hides ghosts. The Amur tiger, largest of all big cats, stalks these forests. Fewer than 600 remain in the wild, most of them here. Stripes blending with shadow, paws silent on the snow. It is a predator built for power and patience, and it rules this land like nothing else. Alongside the tiger, another survivor moves in the undergrowth, the Amur leopard. Smaller, more elusive, and far rarer. Once on the edge of extinction, with barely 30 left in the wild, it has made a fragile comeback under protection. Still, seeing one is nearly impossible. The forest hides them well, and they prefer it that way. Vladivostok is the last stop of the Trans-Siberian Railway, where tracks finally meet the sea. Nearly 6,000 miles of steel running across 2 continents. 7 time zones stretched out across forests, steppes, mountains, and rivers. A journey not of hours, but of days. Construction started in 1891 under Tsar Alexander III, when Russia wanted to bind its empire together from west to east. Thousands of workers were sent into the wilderness. They cut through taiga, spanned rivers, laid track across permafrost. Progress was slow, brutal, costly, but by 1916, the line was complete. A ribbon of iron tying Europe to the Pacific. Without it, Russia's Far East would remain unreachable. With it, the East became part of the whole. The ride itself is an act of endurance. Moscow to Vladivostok takes a week if you don't step off, the days blurring into nights. Siberia has many faces: frozen tundra, endless taiga, jagged mountains. But nothing prepares you for Lake Baikal. The world's deepest, oldest, and clearest freshwater lake. A body of water so immense it feels like an inland ocean. On first approach, it looks calm, almost serene. Blue stretching to the horizon, cliffs rising from the water. But beneath that glassy surface are chasms over 1,600 meters deep. Rifts formed by the earth itself, tearing apart. In winter, the ice thickens, but it's not solid. Cracks run like lightning. Air bubbles are trapped under the surface. Cathedrals are built along the shore. Caves, where waves once broke against cliffs, now sealed in crystal. Inside, icicles hang like organ pipes. Light filters through blue and green, turning the walls into stained glass. Baikal is life, too. Its waters are home to the Nerpa, the only freshwater seal species on Earth. Scientists still argue how it ended up here, stranded in this inland sea. The Yamal Peninsula is a flat, endless stretch of tundra, locked in ice for most of the year. Temperatures here easily drop below -60 Fahrenheit, and the sun can vanish for months. Most people would call it unlivable. For the Nenets, it's home. There are nomads, moving with the seasons across Yamal, following the migrations of their reindeer herds. The animals are everything: transport, food, clothing, and shelter. A Nenets camp rises in the form of chooms, conical tents of reindeer hide. Life here is stripped to its essentials. After brief stops, families dismantle their temporary homes, load everything onto sleds pulled by reindeer, and move on. There are no shortcuts, no backups. Just knowledge passed down for generations, and a stubborn resilience that makes the impossible ordinary. The Nenets don't live in the past. They live in the present more fully than most people ever do. Siberia hides landscapes that don't fit into the clichés of endless forest and frozen wasteland. The Putorana Plateau is one of them. It lies far above the Arctic Circle, locked away from roads and cities. A place so remote that even most Russians have never seen it. Towering basalt plateaus stretch to the horizon, broken by deep canyons and hundreds of waterfalls. In fact, some geographers call it the land of 10,000 lakes and 1,000 waterfalls. The numbers aren't poetry, they're an understatement. About 250 million years ago, volcanoes here flooded Siberia with lava, layer upon layer, until the land rose into this massive basalt plateau. Later, glaciers carved it, rivers sliced through it, and time left behind a labyrinth of gorges, cliffs, and steppes. There are no highways to the plateau. To get in, you fly by helicopter or trek for days through taiga and tundra. It's one of the last places where true wilderness doesn't just exist, it dominates. Just outside Krasnoyarsk, something unexpected rises from the forest. Giant pillars, twisted and cracked, like the skeleton of some vanished world. Locals call them the Stolby, the Krasnoyarsk Pillars. Geologically, the monoliths are cousins of the Lena Pillars. Ancient intrusions of syenite, magma that cooled underground 450 million years ago. What's left are towers, walls, and boulders. Some stand nearly 300 feet tall, worn smooth in places, jagged in others. For more than a century, locals have been climbing them, often with no ropes, no gear, just hands and nerve. They call themselves Stolbists, and in Soviet times they built a whole underground culture here, part sport, part rebellion. The authorities didn't always approve, but Stolby gave people a way to escape. The forest was freedom. The pillars were a challenge. At the southern edge of Siberia, where the borders of 4 countries converge, the land suddenly rises. The Altai Mountains are one of the most geographically diverse regions in Eurasia. Glaciated peaks exceed 13,000 feet, with Mount Beluga almost reaching 15,000 feet, the highest in the range. From these elevations, rivers descend into deep valleys, feeding vast river systems that eventually flow across Siberia. Among the more unexpected features is Geyser Lake. Despite its name, it is not driven by geothermal activity. Instead, it is a small, intensely colored lake, where mineral-rich springs push fine blue clay upward from the bottom. Further south, the terrain becomes more severe. The Katu Yarik Pass cuts sharply down into the Chulishman Valley. Descending over 800 meters through a series of tight switchbacks carved into the mountainside. In that valley, erosion has shaped one of the region's most unusual formations, the Akurum stone mushrooms. These are tall, pillar-like rock formations topped with wider caps, formed as softer material beneath erodes. Over time, the base narrows, leaving structures that resemble oversized mushrooms balanced on thin stems. Cholishman Valley stretches all the way to Lake Telitskoye, one of the largest and deepest lakes in Siberia. Stretching over 40 miles and reaching depths of more than 1,000 feet, it holds a significant portion of the region's freshwater. Surrounded by steep, forested slopes, it functions almost like a fjord. With rivers and waterfalls feeding into it from all sides. Stretching across the whole continent, the scale of Russia resists easy definition. So close and so distant. Often misunderstood, this land reveals itself as a continuum of histories. Where European and Asian influences do not collide, but overlap. Empires rise and fall, systems change, borders move, but much of the underlying structure remains. Trade routes become highways. Fortresses become cities. Remote settlements become industrial centers. And in between, vast areas remain largely untouched, defined more by distance than by development. Beyond the immense scale, Russia is a country rich in culture, traditions, and deep history.